Well, hello and welcome back to Faith, Philosophy and Life with me, Mr. Shelton. I had promised you a little session on exam technique for Eduqas, and I'll make it very clear that I am not an examiner for the exam board, and so this is merely my own opinion based on my year's worth of teaching. So take it or leave it, but I think it's really helpful anyway for you to look and reflect on, take the bits that you like and ignore the bits that you don't. So we're thinking about Judaism, and I thought it'd be a good time to give you an exam. The exam is linked in the description below, so please click on that and you will find that, or if you're one of the pupils at my school, then you will find that on the Okay, so what you need today is you do need a pen and a piece of paper to make some notes on, and I'd like you to go and get that while we've got our cheesy intro music. Okay, so welcome back. Our title today then is how can you best answer exam questions? How can you best answer exam questions? So our learning objective is to consider different approaches to examination questions and how it is best to answer them. And our literacy objective today is to answer an example question in detail using PEEK. Okay, so you'll know point evidence explanation quite literally, and all I've done is I've just extended that a little bit to fit the exam board. So a good outcome would be if you can explain two things that you could put in an exam answer. Great if you can attempt to answer exam questions using at least one technique correctly, and even better if you can use some specialist terms to link all the answers we've studied into a number of exam answers as well. So our literacy skill, we're reading for meaning because we're going to be extracting information, but it's really focusing on that exam technique of PEEK as we've been talking about. So we're going to look at some exam thoughts. We're going to do an exam. It might take a couple of sessions for you to do, and then we'll review it as well. But the exam's only going to be half an hour, so hopefully you can get this all done within an hour. So first off then, I would like you to pause this clip, and I'd like you just to think for a moment, what can you remember about any of these topics? What can you remember about any of these topics? So pause this clip now, have a think, and if you need to look back through your notes, please do so. Brilliant. Okay, so hopefully now you've got an idea on all of those. So the question is, what do you think would make a good answer to an exam question? The usual things that I hear in lesson are things like, oh, it needs a bit of explanation, it needs an example, maybe it needs a quote if you've been following the work that you've been doing for other elements of the course, and all of that is absolutely true. You do need all of that for a good exam answer. But the key thing is you need to answer the question. You can't just leave a question blank, because if you do, you will get 0 marks. I once took a pupil's piece of work and put it under the visualizer, and he'd written nothing in the 8 minutes previous. Whether he'd just slept for it, I do not know. But I asked the pupils to identify what grade that he would have got had that been a GCSE exam. And the result came back that it would have been a U. It would have been a U because he'd written nothing. Even though that slightly concerned the child, it made a point. And that child went on to get a good grade at GCSE later in the year, so I was obviously really pleased with that. However, it was a thing that he had to learn to write. He couldn't just sit there and hope that the grade miraculously appeared on the results day, because it wouldn't have done if he'd put no effort into it at all. So the first thing I would say for this exam, again based on Eduqas, it's about 1 mark a minute. It's a 60-mark question paper, and it's a 60-minute question paper. So that indicates to you that it's 1 mark a minute. If you've got a 2-mark question, it should take you about 2 minutes. It's possible that you can get through some of the questions quicker. However, a 15-mark question should only take you 12 to 13 minutes, because if you can do that, then you've got a little bit of time at the end in order to check it all over. So we're going to look at some A questions now. This is an A question is one that will always ask you to define a key term. So a couple of examples here that I've come up with is define what's meant by creation, or what is meant by the Noahadic covenant. So if you wrote, for example, creation is when you make something, that's worth 1 mark. If you said the Noahadic covenant is a promise made to Noah, that would be worth 1 mark, because there's one piece of information there. So I would strongly recommend that you do an explanation and an example. An explanation and an example. So what's meant by creation? Creation is when you make something. For example, God made the world. That's a strong answer. That will gain you 2 marks. The Noahadic covenant was when God made a promise with Noah, 1 mark, to never flood the world again, and to do that he put a rainbow in the sky. 2 marks. It's a strong answer. So A questions are actually really straightforward. You can even guarantee that you know what your A question will be before you go into the exam board. In the specification, you have these words. These are the words for Judaism: synagogue, Shekinah, Shabbat, kosher, Torah, mitzvot, Messiah, and covenant. You need to know what those words are. And what you then need to do is you need to be able to both give a definition and an explanation of each of those words. So over the course that we are studying, you need to make sure that you know those, and both the definition and an example. And if you know that, you're guaranteed 2 marks in the exam, or 4 marks, because you get 2 A questions. You rock up, you open the paper, and you will see 2 of those words, 1 in section A and 1 in section B. It's as simple as that. So they are your A questions, and they are your first question in both sections of the paper. So you must know, and I'll keep going on with that, both the example and the definition of each of those key words. And when you get to the exam that we're looking at today, one of those keywords will be on that, and you need to both give an example and explain it. And I would suggest that you make some notes about the exact technique I'm going through with you now, so you can get full marks when they're being marked. We're going to look at the B question now. So a B question is an AO1 exam question. That basically means it only wants information. So in this exam, you'll be asked to describe something change the faith or the world. So how did something change faith or the world? Now, as you can see, it's a 5-mark question. Now we know from what I've said at the start, therefore it's 5 minutes long. So you're not actually after writing 3/4 of a page. There are lines on the exam as an indication of how much you need to write. And basically you need to write about a paragraph. It's as simple as that. 2 paragraphs, probably too much. You really need 4 bits of information and 1 quote, and that quote being explained. There's no point writing a quote if you don't explain it. This is a describe question. You're basically putting information in. And once you've put your 4 bits of information, say for example, how did Moses change Jewish history? Well, you've got the idea of the Passover, you've got the idea of taking the Jews out of Egypt, you've got the idea of the 10 Commandments, and you've got the idea of him being God's chosen leader, or the Jewish law, in fact, with the Torah. Now, there's my 4 parts without too much effort, and what I might do is just explain each of those, linking those to how they would affect Jewish history today. So the idea that Jews still follow the law, the idea that Jews still respect Moses, the idea that they still have the 10 Commandments. In fact, that's quite a cultural thing for many different religions. So all of that would fit within this question. So you're after 4 bits of information, all of which has been explained a little bit. And then you need a quote. Now, I've used these before with you, okay, and these are my Judaism Chamber quotes that you may have written down previously. So I would strongly suggest that you make a note of some of those, pause this if you need to, but the key thing is to identify a quote that would fit the question about Moses. So you've got, for example, now set your heart and soul to seek the Lord your God. If Moses hadn't done what he'd done in terms of learning the law and passing that law on, then the 613 mitzvot wouldn't be in place, and therefore Moses wouldn't be doing that. Or you've got the I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Again, if you weren't if you didn't know about Moses, you wouldn't be able to choose that quote. It wasn't Moses that brought them out of Egypt, it was God. However, God did use Moses to do that, hence why it works. Now let's see how that works with the exam criteria. Okay, so behind me is the exam criteria, and what you've got here is you've got this idea that when you look at this very clearly, it's into 4 bands. Well, band 0 isn't really a band, so maybe it's in 3 bands. The band 1 is it's a limited statement of information about the religious idea. So you basically know a little bit about Moses for the example we're looking at, and then it has teachings or concepts. It's a limited understanding of how belief influences individuals and communities. But then the key thing then is that second part, uses religious specialist language in terms and or sources of wisdom or authority in a limited way. If you don't have a quote, you'd get away with a band 1. You'd also get away with a band 2, which is a 2 to 3 mark without a quote. But please note, you do need to be using religious terms in those. However, for a band 3, it says uses a range of appropriate religious specialist language and terms and sources of wisdom and authority extensively. So there's an absolute key thing there that you must be using a quote or a source of authority. It doesn't have to be a quote, it could be something about conscience or something like that to fit a band 3. Please also note the first word in, or the first 2 words, sorry, in each of those boxes. A limited, a good, or an excellent answer. Okay, so a limited, a good, or an excellent answer. You must be looking at those as well. So again, it's no point just writing 1 or 2 words or a couple of sentences, because that would only be limited. That's why you need your depth. So if you aim for those 4, as we've talked about, and you tie that together with a quote which is explained back to the question, I'll come on to peak later, then that would be a really helpful thing for you to do. Okay, so looking at that information now, how would we approach this question? Describe how Moses changed Jewish history. We've already talked about what quote we would use, and then you go on to write that answer. You might want to do that now, or you might want to look at this question. Describe how the fall of Jerusalem changed Jerusalem. Describe how the fall of Jerusalem changed Judaism. So you might want to look at this question. Describe how the fall of Jerusalem changed Judaism. That's 5 marks. So again, you're after 4 bits of information with a quote. So have a look at that. Maybe have a go at that. Pause this clip whenever. I'm going to move on to the C question. Now the C question is worth 8 marks. In this exam, you'll be asked to explain the importance of a person to the faith. And it's an explain question. A B question is a describe question, it's an information question. A C question you need to do a little bit more with. You're not evaluating it, but you are explaining it. So for example, explain why Moses was important to Judaism. Really important question there, because that would fit with quite a number of biblical characters. Explain why Abraham was important to Judaism. Explain why the covenants are important in Judaism. That's a classic sort of question that's worthy of you to consider as a style. So, explain how King David changed the Jewish nation. It's a very, very similar approach. So to do that, you need 2 paragraphs, peak paragraphs. So peak stands for point, point, evidence, explanation, change. Point, evidence, explanation, and change. Some of you may have used PEAL in your English lessons, point, evidence, explanation, link. It's a very similar structure to that. I've added a couple of extra points at the start, point, deliberately, just to make sure that you've got relevant information to get to that 8 marks band, what you're going to look at in a moment. Then you've got your evidence, which is a quote, which is the Judaism Shema quote. Then you've got your explanation, and then you've got change. And remember, at the bottom of each criteria, let me put it there for you, it says in that the first paragraph of each of them, last sentence, a good understanding of how belief influences individuals, communities, or societies. So that's the change element there that we've been talking about. So if you look at a band 4, it's an excellent, again, you've got those similar keywords, an excellent, a very good band 3, a good band 2, a limited band 1. If you then look at the second paragraphs, which are also really important, you've got use of specialist language in a band 1 and all sources of wisdom. And in a band 2, you've got use a specialist language and or sources of wisdom. Then for a band 3, you've got uses and religious specialist language and sources. So that's where you get to your and section. And then obviously your band 4 is also your and as well. So you must have those in. So have a look at one of those questions now. I'm going to pop the Judaism shamer back up. Now, the other thing to say is about the 2 peak paragraphs. Not every question would suit this, but some questions may lend themselves to Orthodox or Reformed. So if they lend themselves to a Jewish perspective, that, for example, it lends itself to a question about kosher. I know you haven't done kosher yet with me, but you may have some idea that they're the Jewish food laws. You might say an Orthodox Jew would strongly suggest that kosher food laws should still be followed. But then you also might say a Reformed Jew in your second paragraph might suggest that they're out of date and give reasons as to why. Now, not every C question is going to fulfill that criteria, but I do think that it's worth you keeping in the back of your mind, can I do Orthodox and Reformed Jews when it comes to this C question? Because if you can, it's going to be advantageous for you to do it. Now, obviously, neither of these questions behind me require you to do that, but it does require to have 2 paragraphs of PPEEC, peak. It does require you to have 2 peak paragraphs. So if we look at this, and you had the question about Moses, well, we've already talked quite a lot about Moses in the last one. Those quotes would work. As long as you don't use the same quote twice in one question, you're okay to use it across them. But as I've said previously, you've got to make sure that the quote's worthy of using and you explain it fully back to the question, because the exam board don't look favourably upon people that just put quotes in without any explanation of them. If you're looking at the question about how the King David's temple, you might say that's a little bit harder because none of these are about King David, which is absolutely true. However, you have got now set your heart and soul to seek the Lord your God, and that was something David definitely did. And by doing the temple and by people going to the temple, it helped them identify their belief in God. Then we move on to our so there's a C question for you, which you may want to have a go at. Explain why Moses was important to Judaism, 8 marks. And obviously that should take you about 8 minutes as well. Then we're going to look at the D questions. Now the D questions are actually worth half of your mark. Yep, you heard me that correctly. The D questions are worth half of your mark. So if you think 2, 5 and 8 is 15 marks. And then there's a 15 mark D question as well. So this should take you the same length of time as the A, B and C together. This is how long a D question should take you. Now it's always a statement. You'll be familiar with this format from other parts of this exam. It's always a statement that ends with discuss this statement showing that you've considered more than one point of view. You must refer to religion and belief in your answer. Can make it very clear in this exam you do get no marks for humanists or atheists, and make sure you do not refer to any other religion like Christianity or Islam in this paper. It is a Judaism paper and it is Judaism only that will gain you marks. Anything else is a waste of ink and definitely a waste of your time. So here's a couple of example of questions. Abraham was the best time in Jewish history, and living in the promised land isn't necessary for Jews anymore. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to think about what the mark scheme looks for and then how that might translate into a format. As you'd expect, this is a large marking criteria because it is worth up to 15 marks. So a band 5 then, again you've got excellent, very good, good, and then it goes down to limited statement and then poor. So that's our opening gambit. So you've got to make sure that you've got those terms in there as well. Again, look at the second section. You've got the and in band 5, the and in band 4, and then the and or in band 3, which is worth your 7 to 9 marks. So again, making sure that you've used a quote in there is really useful. Also, you've got it's about evaluation. So may I suggest that you think about sentences like this is a strong argument because, or this is a weak argument because at the end of each of your paragraphs, because if you do that, that will also help boost that evaluation and that evaluative skill and help you form a judgment. But please note as well, you've got to form a judgment. It's the third line of each of those on the screen behind me. We're using religious teaching and moral reasoning to formulate judgments. If we look at the lower end, you've also got it in that 4 to 6. However, on a 1 to 3, there's no attempt to formulate judgments. So it's really important that you answer the question and focus upon the question. So if we looked at this question here, living in the promised land isn't necessary for Jews anymore. Now, you can use Orthodox and Reformed Jews in this. You don't have to, but again, it depends on the nature of the question. If it lends itself, do it, and if it doesn't lend itself, don't do it. And I would suggest that you look at FAMI, for, against, rebuttal, my opinion, and if everyone. For, against, rebuttal, which basically means a third point of view, my opinion, and if everyone, that's the E. And you look at your peak for definitely for the first two, that way you've got your quotes in that have been explained. So if you've got a question about the promised land, for example, you might start by talking about the Abrahamic covenant. That would fit with your for. Then you might talk against your against, saying that Jews live across the world now and the impact that they had in, for example, like Liverpool. Then you might have a third viewpoint. Now that could be, for example, that Jews are able to follow the laws anywhere, that the temple's not in Jerusalem anymore. But please note that my opinion, right? My opinion on this isn't what I think. Exam does not grade you for your opinion. So if you start writing that I think Jews should live in Israel because since 1947 they've been able to, that won't gain you any marks in this exam. The phrase you need to be aiming for is, in my opinion, the strongest argument is. So which of the top three that you've just been writing about is the strongest argument and why? Then there's a formulated judgment. So that's really important that you do that. And then if you think back to the criteria, a good understanding of how belief influences individuals, communities and societies. That's your E, your everyone bit. If everyone agreed with this statement, this would change the world by. Okay, if everyone agreed that Jews don't need to live in the promised land before, what would that mean? Or if everyone disagreed with the statement saying that Jews should live in the promised land, what difference would that make? Now, for some questions, obviously, that's a lot easier to do than others. However, this format works, and it is possible to get this done in between 12 and 14 minutes. So FAMI is the approach I would suggest that you look at for your D questions. So on the screen behind me then is a summary of what we've just talked about. Obviously for the B question I've got use peak, but you don't need to, because as long as you've got your 4 bits of information and you quote, that's most important. For your C, you're using peak twice with Orthodox and Reform if appropriate, and for your D, you're using FAMI with a combination of peak as well. So there's a summary there of what peak is, which we've already spoken about. So what I think would be really helpful for you to do now is to access the exam that's linked in the description below, or see if your teacher's got a different exam for you to do, and give that a go. Maybe photograph it, send it off to your teacher for marking. I certainly would like mine in, please, from you, and you can just email those in to me. Can I thank you very much for your time? Hope that's been useful. Leave this on the screen while you look at the exam. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, wash hands, God bless, and I'll see you next week for the next bit of content.